Welcome to Season 2 of Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. I'm Joshua Sharfstein, Vice Dean for Public Health Practice and Community Engagement, and a former Secretary of Maryland's Health Department. Our goal is to bring scientific evidence and experience to the public health news of the day through informative interviews with scientists, community leaders, policy experts, public health officials, clinicians, and more. If you have ideas or questions for us to cover, please email us at publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Today, I speak to Leonardo Lisi, an associate professor in the Department of Comparative Thought and Literature at Johns Hopkins University and an expert in 19th century Scandinavian literature and philosophy. Our topic? The 1882 play by Henrik Ibsen called The Enemy of the People. It's a play about a doctor who demands action to protect the public's health, and let's just say it does not go well. You do not have to have read the play to enjoy this discussion. Let's listen. Thank you so much, Professor Lisi, for joining me to talk about Enemy of the People by Henrik Ibsen.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So I've been reading about not just one or two, but really dozens of health officials in the United States being attacked verbally, in some cases threatened physically, demonstrations on their front lawn, getting fired, being forced to resign. And it's really been unprecedented in modern times. But this idea that a health official could be making recommendations that are necessary for the health of the community and being vilified for it isn't just a modern idea, is it?
No, on the contrary. You see it in Ibsen's play is a key engagement with that. And interestingly, in fact, Ibsen had the idea from actual historical events that took place at the time. So the practice seems to be long as well, and certainly had its occurrences in the 19th century.
So could you maybe give us a little bit of context on Ibsen and the play, and then we can talk a little bit about what happens?
Right. So Ibsen is a Norwegian dramatist. He's often considered to be the father of modern drama, the first kind of person who initiates a revolution within a drama that leads to the dramatic forms of the 20th century. And at the time of writing this particular play, The Enemy of the People, in 1882, he was in a self-imposed exile, living in Germany, and had just completed previously two very notorious and scandalous plays. He often picked topics that were particularly open to debate and provocative. One in 1879 that he's particularly famous for is A Doll's House, which deals with the question of women's liberation. And just after that, in 1881, he had published another play, Ghosts, which deals with sexually transmitted diseases and incestuous desires and so on and so forth. So he had the European audience in somewhat of an uproar at the time that he sat down to write The Enemy of the People in 1882. And interestingly, in fact, he kind of used that play to reassure his publisher that he would now write something that would be a little more palatable to the general public and not be as offensive, since there had been a certain dip in his book sales, and he was a very keen guardian of his own finances. So he wanted to write something that would be in some ways more acceptable to the general reading public. And so he came up with this play about a health official in a Norwegian coastal town who discovers that the bath that the town is planning, in fact, has poisoned water, or there's a virus of some kind in the water that would make people sick.
Right, and this doctor is Dr. Stockman.
Right, exactly. And he starts the play by having just returned from the outskirts of northern Norway to this position as doctor of the bath that is about to be built.
Right. And this bath is like a public bath. It's sort of like come to the town, go to the bath, right, spend money here. It's sort of like a major economic driver for this little town.
Exactly. And they emphasize repeatedly that it's really the one lifeline the town has in order to make its financial prosperity. And interestingly, Stockman himself came up with the plan while he was in this other position as a doctor up north. He had this idea that the town could be developed into a bath of the sort that in the 19th century was frequently used for health reasons. So he came up with the idea and was implemented, and then he was called back to be the doctor of that particular institution.
Right. And One of his recommendations, though, in how to construct the bath wasn't taken.
Right. That's one of the key things that also plays into the larger some of the tensions in the play. And that was the recommendation that the plumbing that gets the water down to the bath be laid up very high in the mountains. And instead, in a kind of, it seems, cost-cutting measure, the leadership of the town decided to lay the plumbing somewhat lower, which then we learn in the course of the play is the reason why the water is drawn from a certain kind of area that actually has infestation with an undefined virus of source that brings all kinds of diseases.
Right. So he gets a lab result back, basically, that says the water is not safe for the bath. Right. And initially, he thinks he's the hero.
Right. In fact, and he's not alone. At the end of Act 1, the whole first act ends with this kind of moment of rejoicing where everybody's so happy because it's wonderful that he has been able to just make this discovery just in time that will allow people to actually, will allow the bath construction to be rerouted, relay the plumbing in some way so that before having opened up to the general public, they can correct this problem. And there's this general assumption that, well, look, this is best for the society because of the social community they're in, because it will actually prevent people getting sick. And it's, of course, the best thing to do because that's what one should, morally speaking, do. And it's also scientifically true what he has discovered. And it's also best for him in this way because he has, in fact, been able to be vindicated in the original plan that he had proposed of laying the plumbing higher up. And so there's a certain kind of pleasure in the fact that he will now be celebrated. And this is wonderful coming together of scientific, moral truth, community well-being, and individual success. That is a kind of harmonious whole that Ibsen is a great master of taking and just destroying and showing you that actually that kind of a combination of everything going together well never really holds in reality.
Yeah, it does not go well for Dr. Stockman.
It does not go well for Dr. Stockman, although the way in which it doesn't go well is interesting because it goes through a number of different incarnations of what the problem really is. In the beginning, he thinks, and the audience is led to think, if they don't know the play yet, that the real challenge to this harmonious unity of personal and social well-being is the rivalry that he has with his brother, right? They say in the beginning, well, I know that my brother Peter, who is the highest official in the town, is going to be upset at me. He'd be the only person who would be upset at this glorious realization that there was a virus in the water because he would have preferred to make the discovery himself so that he could reap the benefits. And so in the beginning, one thinks, well, this is really a problem of individual psychologies, right? We're going to see a play here about how fraternal rivalry is going to have it out between two individuals who are kind of at each other, like a Dr. Fauci versus Donald Trump, that are going to have it out in the public sphere. Right. And then very quickly it turns out that actually the personal problematic is only one of a whole range of problems that the discovery of this virus actually lays bare, right? It's not just a personal problem, it's also a social problem, it's also a moral problem and even a historical problem of sorts, and it kind of makes it grow.
Right, the town comes to realize that closing down the baths would be a huge economic problem for them.
Right, exactly. In the first instance, he got support from a contingent of the town, which is the people who are running the local paper, the only paper in the town, which is a kind of liberal democratic paper. And they come to Stockman and say, yesterday when we were all happy about the fact that you have discovered this virus and we can now correct it, I hadn't really thought through what this actually means. And I think that we really have to remember, he says to Stockman, is that this isn't really just a problem about the local bath, right? What really is at stake here is the fact that it's symptomatic of the way in which the town is being run, right? Actually, the bath is itself a symptom of the way in which the aristocratic elite mismanages their power by trying to cut corner and doesn't have any concern for the well-being of the majority of the people. So we should really take this opportunity in order to make this into a rallying cause to shine some light on the way in which the city is being run by an abusive system of sorts, and this would be our chance.
So it seems like at that moment that the media is on the side of Dr. Stockman.
Right, exactly. And then the media is with him, and he's all happy because, although he doesn't see why that would be necessary, he will have, as they say, the compact majority behind him, and he will be the most powerful man in town because he has the backing of the papers and the community groups and so on and so forth.
But his brother has a powerful argument.
But then his brother comes and says, so to say, the hard facts that actually, to the media, to the representatives of the media, that actually solving this problem, they have to remember, will, on the one hand, cost hundreds of thousands of kroners, which is a substantial sum of money because relaying the plumbing is a major undertaking. On the other hand, it will mean that they will have to close down the bath for 2 years. Right? And during those 2 years, the neighboring villages will likely take the opportunity in order to have their own shot at proposing coolant baths. So the whole financial future of the community will all of a sudden be at risk. And that's when the representatives of the liberal democratic wing of things realize that actually there are certain moments in which it turns out that scientific truths are subservient to political interests, right? And then actually maybe for them it wasn't to the biggest advantage to announce this because the people that they represent will be the ones who suffer the most because, of course, the leadership of the town says they're not going to invest any more money into it because they've already paid for the bath to be constructed. They're not going to pay again for it to be corrected, so it must be from the general public.
Right,
so
and then all things just really go south for Dr. Stockman at that point. There are public meetings. People say things like, the man who can throw out such offensive insinuations about his native town must be an enemy to our community. So the enemy of the people is the health official.
Exactly. So Stockman at that point goes from having been the friend of the community as they kind of glorify him in the beginning to all of a sudden becoming the enemy of the people because he persists in the claim that, you can take into consideration the variables of social interests or of particular interests when you pursue truth. And here, Ibsen does also paint an ambiguous picture of Stockman himself because there is this kind of absolute commitment to truth at all costs.
Right, the cost of his family, they threaten his family, he just sticks to it, and he gets angrier and angrier. And at one point he says, and this line really struck me, he says something to the effect of, I made a great discovery, the discovery that all the sources of our moral life are poisoned, and the whole fabric of our civic community is founded on the pestiferous soil of falsehood.
Right, exactly.
So it becomes a play not just about the public health, versus the economy, let's say.
Right, exactly.
But really about what truth is and who can speak to truth.
Right, exactly. And that's where the play, in a way that, Ibsen is a great master of constructing almost in a laboratory setting kind of way, a perfect environment. So he moves it through these various stages of the deepening understanding of what the implications are. And he ends up in this position that you've just read out of, where he realized that it's not just a problem that is generated between persons, and it's not just a problem between individual classes of society, and it's not even just a problem between society as a whole and some kind of moral commitment to ideal values of truth and goodness, but somehow everything ends up revealing itself to be corrupt. And ultimately what he says is, look, I'm not even interested any longer in human rights. I'm not even interested in defending truth any longer, because I've come to realize that actually truth, and this is kind of the most radical version, that itself only has a shelf life of 20 years. There is no such thing as absolute values that you can kind of try to hold society to. You have to realize that the only truth there is the truth that has not yet been accepted by the majority of people. And this is a very kind of bizarre and counterintuitive claim, and one would have to really look at the play in order to catch it out. But the key thing that he is trying to put on the table there, I think, is this claim that actually what the pandemic, or not the pandemic, the public health crisis in that town has shown is that what is corrupt and has to be rejected isn't just individuals or classes or society as such, but in a sense, everything that exists in the present right now is so rotten that you have to get away with it. And the only hope that we have for saving ourselves is if we can somehow have individuals who are sufficiently free and independent from society to allow them to imagine completely different kind of social orders than the ones we have. Because the one we have, nothing can be saved. It's just too bad. And that's a radical kind of pessimism tied with a radical kind of utopian position that Ibsen has. Where he said, well, the world as it is, there's nothing good left. But on the other hand, we have a hope that if we can educate those people to some people to free themselves enough from the society that they don't have any investment in this current status of the way things are, they might be able to give us a new vision of what the world might look like.
Yeah. Now, I think that we should turn to the pandemic. I heard you make the Freudian slip of saying pandemic, but it's on your mind when you're reading this play again.
Absolutely.
And it's not just because of these sort of public battles over public health and the economy, battles that really could be ripped from this play, where people are accusing health officials of being enemies of the people for saying, we have to shut down bars, or we can't go to, concerts inside, or things like that, or wear masks, for example. People have just been, attacked as if the problem is the health advice, not the virus. But, there are moments when, you wonder what is really underneath that hatred. What is that reflecting? And is it saying something about society? That we can have such a vitriolic exchange right now about some pretty basic things in public health. And I don't think I succumb to like that tremendous pessimism that you just explained all the time, but I have my moments. When you read about some things that are happening or how people are responding to Dr. Fauci or others who are just trying to, do their jobs and explain what the basic evidence is. I mean, it really, really makes you, pause for a second. And that's kind of what Ibsen is doing and saying, like, how deep does this go?
Right. And I think that, Ibsen, I think on the one hand is clearly shining light on the idea that the resistance people have to those kind of measures, on the one hand, can be explained in terms of just pure self-interest. Right? It could be explained just from psychological resistance. Right? If my brother comes up with it, I'm going to be against it because I hate against my brother, so I have to be against it in principle. But it also could be just a question of self-interest, or economic, financial self-interest. And he is very sarcastic towards those kind of ways of compromising with what the demands of the truth, in quotation marks, are. On the other hand, I think he's also sympathetic to the fact that it's not that simple as Dr. Stockman thinks, possibly, that you should just abide by the truth, right? There's a certain one-sidedness to Stockman that I think also Ibsen is suspicious towards. And I think we see that in our own conversations too. It's not as though when the discussion about opening up the economy, or closing up the economy, or opening up the schools, or closing the schools gets very partisan, then it fails to understand the complexity of the situation, right? That in fact, yes, closing down the economy or working from home is a luxury for a lot of people, or not sending the kids to school is a privilege to a lot of people as well. And it's not that simple.
Dr. Stockman, let's just say, doesn't have the greatest bedside manner.
He doesn't have exactly. And he's willing to go all out at the cost of everything in the belief that
he's not a bridge builder.
He's not a bridge builder, absolutely. And of course, that's his point, right? That's tied to that pessimism, I would say, ultimately, where everything is rotten, I don't want any bridges, right? The only hope is that there are people who can actually reach out far enough in the future that they're not tied to the present. But there's no bridge building in that respect, because any attempt to compromise is, again, from his perspective, an attempt to somehow defend the status quo, and the status quo is the problem.
Yeah. So in the end, he really goes all in on that particular vision. He sort of stands as like a pole in the discussion today that, like, you have to stick with, your sense of what's right and not be thinking about compromising. I mean, he resists all efforts. Is that fair to say, to do that?
Yeah. Absolutely, and at the end, he has this project of an educational project of sorts, right? To start a school. At first, he thinks, well, I'm going to go to America, because that's what you can kind of do in 19th century Norway if things don't work out for you in Norway. But at the end, he says, actually, no, I'm going to stay here, and I'm going to open up a new school. And I'm going to take those people who are the kids who are poorest on the street, who don't have any commitments or investment in the society in any case, and I'm going to teach them not anything like what we teach in the school, but teach them to be free individuals, which again means something like individuals who are seeking for understandings of society, let's say, that are not tied to the present or the past. And that then ultimately his hope is will be able to force the status quo defenders and the corruption to America instead. So it ends with this vision that, if we only fight out the battle here, we'll be able to kick them out, and then they'll have to deal with them on the other side of the Atlantic instead of us. But he has this radical revolutionary project, which is no longer a project about a particular health crisis, right? It's a project having used the health crisis as a springboard to realize deeper truths about society, a project that is aimed at reinvigorating society as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's certainly helpful to read this play for some insight as to why people are so upset about public health, and to at least, if not insight into people today, but just to kind of play around with these ideas of why people can be very unhappy to hear unfortunate truths about things that need to be done to protect health. I don't think this is like a guidebook for how to be a health officer.
Right.
I think he's kind of a very stubborn person, and there may have been opportunities for him to, make a deal in one way or another to help out, to make things better. But he doesn't really explore that at all.
Right. And to a large extent, because ultimately for him, it turns out that the project of being a health officer is also not the project as it would be in our world, right? Which I think is probably what we all think the task of a health officer should be, which is to protect the social environment, right? The individuals in it and the institutions in it. I mean, that's what they're there to do. Right? But for him, ultimately, actually, the kind of charge that people might have leveled at him, which they don't do in the play, but one can imagine to say that, well, the cure is worse than the disease. He would embrace that and say, actually, you're right, yes, because ultimately what the real health officials should do for him, right, and that's, of course, where you take the metaphor of the crisis and turn it into a literary thought experiment, is not to save society as it is, but to make it go away, right, and create something new, right? And the real health of a society will be not when you cure the diseased social body back to the condition it previously had, right, but rather when you can let it die off and begin something new. So it's a very different understanding of the health officer's task at the end, right? And it's one that's much closer to what Ibsen would consider to be his own Hippocratic oath, to say that, not to actually protect the patient in their previous, or recuperate into their previous mode of existence, but to generate a new form of life altogether, which depends on the current social order dying away, right? And Ibsen, in that sense, is a radical modernist for whom the only real maxim to live by is to say you have to make it new, right? The old has to be shed away, right?
Well, I think it makes for very interesting thinking about how we recover from a pandemic that has really exposed all kinds of problems. We've talked about the inequities in our society, the underappreciation of science, the underfunding of public health. How you remake that, maybe not all of us are going to go as far as Dr. Stockman, but that ideal, that concept, is something to really appreciate, and that really makes this play pretty great. I'm struck by your point, though, that he wanted to send all of the conventionally minded people to America and leave the rest in Norway, because Norway's doing pretty good with the pandemic. They actually have a negative excess deaths. So there are more people alive in Norway this year than in previous years. Wow. And there are even stories where they're giving subsidies to funeral homes because they don't have as many people dying as they used to. Yes. And so maybe they did remake Norway. Who knows? But take us through one of the last lines that you told me was one of your favorite lines. And it's definitely one that I'm going to start quoting from this play.
Oh, so that's the line where he says to his wife, it's at the end of the play in Act 5 when his house has been stoned, all the windows have been broken, and we meet him kind of in the shadows, and he's trying to regroup and think what he should do after the city has turned on him. And his best pair of pants, which he was wearing to the speech that he gave the day before, has been broken. And he says to his wife, well, one of the things I've learned from this whole experience is that you should never go and fight for truth when wearing your best pair of pants. And I think it's just a wonderful, it's one of those rare but wonderful moments of Ibsenian humor. He's not the most comic of authors, but that's a great line. And I think that's true. I mean, as you were saying before, right, the need that the pandemic places on us to rethink ourselves and our society in fundamental terms, not just in terms of, how will we get the vaccine done or whatever, but actually we think the fundamental inequities that the pandemic has laid bare is something that mostly cannot be done in a nice pair of pants unless you are willing to have them broken, right? And we see that in the kind of social upheavals that our society right now is suffering from, right? I mean, those kind of growing pains or cataclysmic situations are the ones in which reassessments of the fundamental structure of society take place.
Yeah, so you should not go fighting for truth in your best pair of pants.
Absolutely not.
Yeah, I think that works both at a literal and metaphorical level. Thank you so much, Professor Lisi, for joining me for this fascinating discussion.
Thank you for having me, Josh.
Public Health on Call is produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, Stephanie Desmond, and Lamari Morales. Audio production by Spencer Greer, Niall Owen McCusker, Cian Oates, and Matthew Martin, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Thank you for listening.